Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. I'm sure that many of you have at least one interest that's fairly niche. It could be something like flower arrangements, or bug collecting, or crochet. Just something that you wouldn't expect the majority of people to really get. Well, for me, that's racing games. I know what you're thinking. The video game industry has literally never been bigger than it is right now. What used to be a pastime only for self-confessed geeks has blossomed into a hobby that can be enjoyed by almost anyone, no matter the demographic. Games that involve driving are of course part of the wider gaming landscape, but I believe that they exist in quite a unique position. Despite the fact that, like gaming as a whole, there have never been more people engaging with them than there are today, racing games are kinda irrelevant. Think about this. When was the last time you saw a general gaming YouTuber, for example, make a video about a racing game? Okay, now when was the last time you saw a general gaming YouTuber make a video about a racing game that wasn't Mario Kart? Yeah, exactly. Really, could you imagine someone like Video Game Donkey suddenly talking about Gran Turismo or Forza? Fat chance. Of course, this isn't the end-all and be-all, but rather the symptom of something much deeper. Some people will be quick to point to the perceived decline in modern racing games as the reason why, a topic which I have covered as well, but I just don't think it's that simple. Irrespective of their quality, to the mainstream audience, racing games just seem to have a strange stank to them. Sorry, I couldn't think of a better word. In some ways, they almost exist separately from the main gaming zeitgeist. This is a phenomenon that I've always been curious about, and whether you're also a die-hard racing game enthusiast, or merely just a casual enjoyer, I think you should be too. Today, I'm going to not only try and unravel how and why this came about, but also how this perception affects the games themselves, and where this could lead us in the future. Okay, racing games aren't mainstream. So what? There are plenty of niche gaming genres that serve a very specific audience, so why is this case any different? Well, there are a number of factors we need to consider. The first, and arguably most important, is that it wasn't always like this. Rewinding back to the 2000s, racing games were a lot more prominent in general gaming discourse. I recently made a retrospective on Gran Turismo with a focus on the first 6 games in particular, and during my research, I noticed this quite often. The way that media outlets talked about the games at the time was very different to how they do now. They were regularly mentioned within the same breath of other anticipated releases, and the wording used never made them seem as other. They were just games. And when it came to their popularity, the numbers spoke for themselves. Whilst it was the biggest racing franchise at this point, Gran Turismo wasn't an outlier. This is a time when racing games could be truly mainstream. Once again, the obvious response is to relate this to the quality of these games, which is fair. However, I think this perception says as much about the games themselves as it does the people who play them. And that latter point is what I want to hone in on. During this period, it's clear that racing games didn't give off the same stank, or at least nowhere near as much as they do now. Whilst people rarely ever talk about it directly, there's long been a perception that to truly enjoy driving games, you have to be into cars. Or bikes, the same idea still applies. However, whilst that tends to be the case, I strongly disagree with this in principle. I believe that as long as a game is compelling enough, you can still enjoy it regardless of the subject. I mean, do you need to have an interest in Italian plumbers to enjoy a Mario game? Of course, most racing games, especially those with licensed cars, tend to be more specialized, because they know that their core audience will be people who are passionate about them. Even the older Gran Turismos, in spite of their wider popularity, were prone to this as well. Because whilst they do contain systems and structures that anyone with an interest in video game design can appreciate and enjoy, they're not immediately obvious. And without that knowledge, they can just seem like dry experiences where all you do is drive cars to collect more cars. I would completely understand why the average gamer might take a glance at them and not really care. But it doesn't have to be this way. Driver San Francisco is a title that I think really highlights how a game centered on driving can still appeal to a wider audience. Released back in 2011, this game was the 5th mainline entry in the long-running Driver franchise, where you play as Detective John Tanner. But there are a few things that set it apart from its predecessors. For one, it's the first game in the series to include fully licensed cars, and 2, it features a pretty unique gameplay feature where you can warp into other characters and take control of their vehicles. This opens up a number of fascinating gameplay scenarios, which the game is very happy to lean into during the course of its run. So, in summary, Driver San Francisco ties its open-world sandbox together with a fun gameplay gimmick, as well as a solid story with interesting characters to drive things along. At the same time, it features a pretty strong car roster, from the usual faces we expect to see, to legendary icons, and even some deeper cuts. This is all topped off with an intuitive arcade-style handling model that can be enjoyed by both casuals and more experienced racing game players alike. I haven't really talked about this game much on the channel before, but I have to say that Driver San Francisco is one of my all-time favourites. I think it's a masterpiece. And crucially, I don't think that's an uncommon opinion. Driver San Francisco isn't a good racing game, it's simply a good game, and that's an important distinction to make. In fact, to call it a racing game at all isn't really fair, as whilst racing is part of it, that isn't really the point. Driver SF is pretty much just an open-world action game where you happen to be limited to driving cars. In this respect, driving is merely a form of movement and style of control, rather than the defining aspect. This might just seem like semantics, but I think that this is an important factor in why the game is the way that it is, and why it's gotten attention from so many people outside of the racing game bubble. Because it shatters the predefined expectations of what a game that focuses on driving can be. And when you shift your perspective from driving defining a game's genre to it simply being a form of movement, it makes you realize that there are so many more possibilities on the table. So this is how some people are able to absolutely adore this game, despite having no interest in cars and driving whatsoever. But what's really special is that Driver San Francisco only works as well as it does because it's a driving game, not in spite of it. It uses this form of gameplay to its own advantage to craft an experience like no other game before or since. When you really think about it, it's pure genius. Driver SF is admittedly very strange, and I don't expect most racing games to be even half as unconventional as it is. But what it does is expose how the biases that many people often have towards driving games are totally unfounded. In basic terms, the fact that a game centers on cars and driving shouldn't be a reason to dismiss it. It's what the game does with those basic gameplay elements that really matters. Racing games no longer being relevant in the mainstream has also led to them not really being respected by the wider gaming community. In the minds of most people, they're often shunted off to the side, usually occupying the same place as sports games. After all, if you don't like a sport, why would you play a video game about it? But as I've explained and shown you, you don't have to like cars to appreciate these games. They can stand as their own experiences. In fact, how people separate vehicles from the act of driving is another thing that makes this situation so unique. There are people who like cars and think they're interesting, but have little desire to actually drive them. And for some, the opposite is true. They enjoy the act of driving, but don't care that much about the cars themselves. Typically, how much a driving game appeals to an individual will depend on their own perspective and approach. Personally, I really love cars and driving, as well as intelligently designed and structured games. Considering all of that, it's no surprise that I'm obsessed with racing games, and my YouTube channel is built around analysing and understanding them. But of course, the majority of people don't think the way I do. The thing about media is that even though people like myself will typically be the most vocal about our opinions, because we care so much about the subject and have done enough research to feel confident in our assertions, we are still the minority. And if you want your game to be successful, the easiest way to achieve that is through appealing to the majority. No matter what your niche is, whether it be in art, music, film, or whatever, I'm sure you've experienced this before, where something totally mediocre becomes unbelievably successful, and you're just left wondering if actually you're the stupid one for not thinking it's very good. In these cases, the success of that piece of media is mainly thanks to what I call the uninvested majority. It's not that the taste of the people who support it is necessarily bad, although that is sometimes true, but rather that they simply don't care that much about the media they consume. It's less about them judging the work to be truly great, but rather just good enough. To be honest, you could apply this idea to anything that is a form of expression, but also a commercial product, like cars for example. Most new cars look like ass and drive like it too, but they're made for people who don't really care and thus can't tell. Again, the uninvested majority. And of course, this also applies to modern racing games. If you know my channel, you'll be well aware of my thoughts on Gran Turismo 7. But to give a brief summary, it's a technical standout with plenty of interesting ideas that squanders its massive potential through several baffling design choices that renders its main single player as just a tutorial, and the post-game experience a never-ending grind where nothing feels truly fun or rewarding. Your average live service, I suppose. Now, everyone's opinion of the game will be slightly different, and I appreciate that. However, what I don't appreciate are the comments I used to see effectively implying that none of my complaints are valid because the game looks so good and the cars are so fun to drive, and have you tried VR? OMG, you're missing out, bro. This argument is stupid for pretty obvious reasons, but the core idea of GT7 being technically impressive is fair. But the thing is that even though most of them aren't as confrontational about it, a lot of people who play games like these feel a similar way. I know people in real life who play GT7 like this, just booting up every once in a while to enjoy driving their favourite cars around, but not engaging on any deeper level. If that's how people want to interact with the game, then fair enough. But once again, they seem to be the uninvested majority. You might think that situations like these are exactly the reason why we have critics, people who are far more experienced with and invested in a medium than the average person, and so are able to use their position of influence to break down what makes a piece of media fundamentally good or bad. But let's be real, does anyone actually respect the opinions of game journalists? To most of us, they're just an easy punching bag. Whilst it used to be the case that people looked up to critics for having more refined and educated views, that no longer seems to be the case. To be honest, this all relates to the more widespread problem that is the declining quality of journalism. More often than not, it just feels like their opinion is whatever they think will cause the least amount of backlash, rather than a pointed critique of the given subject. So considering all of this, it helps to explain why GT7 hasn't fundamentally changed in spite of its pretty glaring deficiencies. The issue of the uninvested majority is one that you can naturally apply to any type of game, but I feel like racing games are particularly susceptible just because of the simplistic view people often have of them. Look nice, drive well. That could be the tagline of most racing games in current day. But not all of them. There have been plenty of indie titles in recent years that try to do things differently, both through providing new and interesting experiences, as well as homages to previous styles of racing game that the AAA industry has seemingly left behind. However, for as refreshing as these games are, their impact on the mainstream audience will always be limited. Whilst indie gaming generally has seen quite a boom in recent times, with there being a number of breakout success stories, within the realm of driving, the results have been far more modest. Even though some have become cult classics, they don't seem to have any degree of influence on the direction of the medium as a whole. Again, it all comes back to how racing games are perceived by the masses, and as a result, the types of experiences people come to them for. The reason why this is the case relates to why games like these even exist. The relation between a driving game and a driving simulator is somewhat complicated. Although we tend to think about simulators as a more recent concept, in truth, the first ever driving games were exactly that. Simulations of driving and not much else. The way I think about it is that a racing game can be a simulator, but a simulator is not inherently a game. People often try to categorize them based on how realistic the driving is, even coming up with halfway terms like simcade. But to be honest, I think that's a fool's errand. Because not only does that potentially change how we categorize games as time goes on and they become outdated, it also ignores what the point of a game is. If Driver San Francisco had simulation physics, would that make it a simulator? I guess, but also not really because that isn't the focus. Either way, I don't really care because I know for certain that it would still be a damn good game. And the opposite is also true. A bad simulator is still a simulator. The fixation on realism can be felt in gaming generally, especially in the graphical department. But the emphasis on realism when it comes to the gameplay is something quite unique to racing games. That's not to say that it doesn't matter in other types of games. There is a certain level of immersion they each strive for, but you'll never hear someone say that it doesn't feel like I'm actually punching them about a fighting game. Of course it doesn't, you're just pressing buttons. The desire to feel like you're actually driving a car is the whole point of why driving games came about. An idea that was further reinforced by games like Gran Turismo that tried to add more simulation value. In current day, the level of realism in some of these games means that they could be used to practice real-life driving techniques. This means that these games are effectively learning tools, something you're not going to see in other genres outside of dedicated simulators. So, hopefully you can now understand how racing games ended up in such a unique position. I feel like this explains a lot of things, such as why racing games are often considered differently from most others, and also why many of them can get away with such blatantly terrible design, and so many people simply don't care or even notice. But racing games are still games, and we should care. You can probably work out by now that it's the double standard on show that really grinds my gears. The sorts of things that I know would get criticised to no end in other types of games often barely gets detected by the general fanbase when driving is involved. And then when you dare to point them out, you get labelled as a whiner and complainer by people who seem to believe that, just because it centres on driving, game design somehow no longer matters. It's pretty sad. So yes, I think the casual perception of racing games is unintentionally making them worse. But even if they were still good, I don't think that would solve the problem. There's no denying that, even at their best, racing games are kind of shallow. They're never going to carry the same emotional weight that you'll find from other games. There is no plot or characters. Except when there are. Racing games with storylines are not especially common, but every once in a while there comes a title that gives it another go. The general perspective is that racing games don't really need plot or characters to be good, and this is true. Some of the most highly acclaimed races ever made feature nothing of the sort, instead relying solely on the strength of their gameplay. But that doesn't mean that a good story can't make a great racing game even better. It's just that most of the time they feel kind of pointless, either existing as a separate side mode which most people ignore, or integrated within the main campaign but having little to no consequence. If you ask me, for a story to actually be worthwhile, it has to have consequences for the gameplay. In most racing games that have them, the only thing that the story influences is the next cutscene. But there is one game I know that breaks the mold. Driver San Francisco is a title that released in 2011. Okay, we don't need to do this again. Yes, Driver SF once again shows just what's possible. Not only does the story dictate all of John Tanner's actions and thus adds meaning to every event, it's also the driving force behind the unique gameplay. As the story progresses, new twists and devices are added into the mix based on the situation Tanner finds himself in throughout the game's evolving narrative. It's a near-perfect marriage between story and gameplay. It makes everything you do, and everything that happens to you, feel meaningful. When it comes down to it, there are two main types of racing games: closed-circuit races and open-world races. For narrative purposes, the latter is definitely preferable since there's just so many more avenues for divergent gameplay. Closed-circuit races, on the other hand, just don't really lend themselves to storylines as well, because for that to work, there needs to be a certain level of structure. So what happens is that either the story feels completely disconnected from your own actions as the player, or it just becomes a linear series of set tasks in which you have zero agency. Neither outcome is really ideal. To be honest, I don't know of any circuit racing games with storylines that I would consider as good, or at least good enough to justify their inclusion. That's not to say that there can't be, it's just that the nature of this style of game makes it a lot tougher to pull off. When looking at video games generally, outside of online games, most mainstream titles are story-driven to some degree, and how much a person enjoys playing said game will often be influenced by what they think of the story. But even for racing games that could be described as story-driven, the actual quality of the story usually doesn't really matter. Their purpose is much more functional than emotional. Once again, it all comes back to gameplay being the sole focus, thus alienating those who don't have a passion for cars or driving, and leading to their often simplistic view of racing games. It's a vicious cycle that nobody really gains from. This is why I think it's important for racing games to diversify their appeal beyond just looking at shiny cars and then driving them fast. Even if that's all that you personally want from a racing game, you have to accept that they are capable of so much more. And this is precisely why I've always championed intelligent game design in racing games. Because even though certain games might not benefit much from a story mode, any game can be improved with sharper game design. And it's not a difficult concept to grasp. It really just boils down to how a game is structured, and thus how all of its elements work together and feed into each other to create the best experience possible for the player. It's a basic principle that underlines most games, but often gets misunderstood or totally ignored when it comes to racing games. Whilst people obviously know which racing games they like and which ones they don't, it's my belief that a lot of people don't fully understand why. Why do you enjoy the racing games that you do? From my experience when asking people this, they usually just list the surface level stuff. It looks great, the driving is fun, it has a good soundtrack, loads of cars, lots of customization, tons of circuits or a massive open world, etc. But the thing is that I've seen people explain why they like a certain game using a similar rhetoric without realizing that these same things can be found in racing games that I know they almost certainly don't like. So what's going on here? Well, part of this will be down to biases that people hold towards games that they have fond memories of, but there is another angle. It's that, alongside the obvious stuff they list, they do also value game design for how it adds meaning to these various aspects, even on a subconscious level. I mean, after all, game design is a basic principle for a reason. Even if you don't fully appreciate it, when done well, it makes the experience that much better. It is the unsung hero in so many highly regarded games, and I've always thought that to be the case with racing games too. Now, I know that by saying things like this, I might be giving off an air of elitism, but the truth is that this blind spot can happen to anyone. I frequently have times when I'm playing a racing game and see a certain feature or design choice that I've enjoyed in other games, but here it just doesn't hit the same, and I'm not really sure why. The only difference is that I'm aware of this contradiction, and my natural curiosity will lead me to seek out an answer, usually one that relates to how that design choice works in conjunction with other aspects of the game, rather than just looking at it in isolation. The disregard for this type of design in more recent titles is the main reason why they feel so one-dimensional, and thus only appeal to people who want very specific things. And when you strip down these games to just those basic things, it isn't good for the industry either. The 2023 Forza Motorsport reboot is pretty much on life support, and it doesn't seem like a new entry is coming anytime soon. Whilst there were various missteps in how the game was handled, if you ask me, it was doomed from the start. It's a simulation-style racing game with a shallow single-player experience that only really has a surface-level appeal. The problem is, the world already has one of those. Effectively, FM23 is just a worse version of Gran Turismo 7. Most of the complaints that could be leveled at the design of that game apply here too, and beyond that, it doesn't look or drive as good as its competitor. And when the mainstream prioritizes those two things above all else, the game has almost nothing going for it. Its failure was pretty much inevitable. What's really sad is when you think about what Forza Motorsport was originally. Not just a Gran Turismo clone on the Xbox, but a genuine rival that made waves by including things they didn't have at the time, like online play, deeper customization, a full damage model, and exotic brands such as Porsche and Ferrari. It was a calculated way to undercut GT, and it worked like a charm, establishing Forza as their direct competitor. You would think that given GT7's very obvious shortcomings, they would be eager to pull off the same trick and thus carve out their own niche. But nope, they just had to jump on the live service bandwagon only so they could fall off and get run over by its proverbial wheels. Like GT7, it put its emphasis on the surface level qualities, whilst neglecting basic game design in a vain attempt to cash in on the uninvested majority. And where that leaves us is that if you want a racing game like Gran Turismo, your only option is Gran Turismo. Under those conditions, it's not hard to understand why GT7 is such a success in spite of its many flaws. The realm of open world racing games isn't much better either. Whilst their Motorsport series is in the toilet, Forza Horizon is the dominant force here. And again, it isn't hard to see why. Nail down the fundamentals, and then be just bland and formulaic enough in design to become insanely popular. And because of that, most other open-world racers on the market, like the Crew Motorfest and TDU Solar Crown, take a similar approach. But if we already have Horizon, then what's the point? These games say and do nothing interesting, and it only makes me wonder how much longer they have left. By now, you should be able to understand not only why the mainstream looks down on racing games, but also how this perception is hurting the quote-unquote genre. Do you want to live in a world where racing games are made specifically for people who don't really care about racing games? Because as time goes on, it feels like we're getting closer and closer to that reality. So, I've laid out the problem in as much detail as I can, but are there any solutions? Whilst I like to think that this video might have some impact on the way people think, it's really just a drop in the ocean. For there to be any meaningful change, I think it has to come from within the industry. For people to truly understand how varied and creative racing games can be, there needs to be varied and creative racing games. One game from 14 years ago isn't going to be enough to start any sort of movement, but it does show just one of many possibilities. However, the desire for change has to be self-motivated. At this point, franchises like Gran Turismo and Forza Horizon are simply too big to fail. They have no reason to change, because no matter what they do, they will always be on top. The next game in either series can be a complete dumpster fire in almost every aspect, but as long as they A, look good, and B, drive well, they're still gonna do just fine. To put it bluntly, racing games need visionaries. not just people who can look at something that was successful and say, yep, that worked, let's just do that again. For as much disdain as I have for what he's done with the franchise recently, there's no denying that Gran Turismo series producer Kazunori Yamauchi is one of these visionaries. His original concept for the series was totally different from any racing game on the market at the time, but he didn't design the original Gran Turismo thinking that it would be a smash hit and bring him fame and fortunes. He just did it because he wanted a game like it to exist. He was pretty much entirely self-motivated, and that passion really comes through in the end product. In the years to come, hopefully there can be more people who find themselves in a similar position, breaking boundaries and showing just what this medium is capable of. A racing game can be an action-adventure game. A racing game can be a role-playing game. A racing game can be a strategy game. A racing game can be anything. Just because a game uses cars as its primary method of movement doesn't mean that it's any less capable of providing meaningful experiences. Even saying that out loud makes me realize just how stupid that assertion is, but you would be shocked by the amount of people who think it's true. Unfortunately, modern racing games have done nothing to help this perception. But if this does change, then maybe, just maybe, racing games will finally get the respect they deserve.